everybody, this is Jonathan Mill, the Hometown Historian channel. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis. I'll talk about this more in depth, so if I repeat myself on several things, I sort of filmed this weirdly, and I'll do better the next time. But this is the Annville sign for the home iron signs. A lot of these were put up in like the 30s and the 40s. So they're quite old, but this is the sign for Annville. It was founded 1762 is what the official date is. Andrew Miller, who actually was the original founder, he was there on site as early as 1742. It was called Millerstown at that point. Eventually, in the 1760s, 62 through 64, the son of Andrew Miller, Abraham Miller, and Hans Adam Ulrich and Abram Reigel, they got together and started to put together the plans and actually put them to fruition, that Andrew Miller's original plans, and then put them together and they came into being. It also changed a little bit because Adam Ulrich brought his lands that were on the northern side of the town, just north off of what was then Market Street, which is today 422. It had been the Dolphin Pike at one point, which was a toll road. And Abram Reigel, who brought his lands that were east of Lancaster Street, or Lancaster Avenue, I believe it's Lancaster Street, he brought his lands that went north to Market Street and were east of Lancaster Street, and that's sort of where everything sort of met between the three. The name of the wife of Adam Ulrich was Juliana, the wife of either Andrew Miller or, I'm guessing probably more likely, Abraham Miller. Her name was Ann Miller, as it said on the sign. They say on the sign that they believe that's why it was changed to Annville in honor of her, but as we talk about later in the film, in this video, that it could potentially be for another reason, which I personally think is probably more likely that, just because the main street at the very get-go of this town was Queen Street, and the main street at that time that was north-south would have been King Street. So, you know, remember, this is when this was founded. This was before the Revolution, so we were still British subjects. And Queen Anne, regardless, was always looked upon very fondly by, you know, the immigrants of this area, because a lot of them were German Huguenots, and some were French Huguenots, and they had been treated very, very well by Queen Anne. So, whichever reason the name Annville became the town name from Millerstown, we don't know. Where the founders are exactly buried, we talk about that deeper in depth as the video goes on. What the real answer to a lot of this stuff is, they're probably out there. I'll try to find out more in depth, contact a few different organizations and people and see if I can find a little bit more, and then maybe do a follow-up video and talk a little bit more in About Town series with more of that information that we know for a certainty. But this is the Hometown Foundations episode 2 of this series for Annville, Pennsylvania. Thanks, everybody. I will also quickly mention here, the reason we didn't film on location live is because this is a really bad place to park. Some of these signs aren't always placed at a great place to park and do filming. They're not put there for that reason, but that's why. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the video. This is the Annville United Brethren Cemetery. There was a church with this at one point, but it no longer exists. So I dubbed in a little bit because I wasn't sure what the name of the cemetery here is. There was a church here at one point. No longer in existence anymore, but we'll go over to Abraham Herr, who was quite important, and then we'll talk about the three founders. I'd like to try to go over to Abram Reigel's mill as well, and once again, it's private property, so the mansion's still there. A number of the other buildings that are sort of surrounding as well. This cemetery is sort of a shame. Is like somebody mows it, but it's just a lot of stones have fallen over. It's sort of a shame. But there you have one of the Hers. There he is, Abraham Her. He is really, really important. Like I said about the house that was back there, that's one of the important houses, and that's part of the historic district. Let's talk about Annville. So now it started out with Andrew Miller. He founded his town. It was in 1742. He had bought this parcel of land, and he wound up buying, I'm trying to think, I'll have to look and get the name. I found that information somewhere, but I haven't been able to find it since. But he bought, I believe the original lot was around 222 acres, but he bought another like 200 some, which is, I believe that lot would have been west of town, and that's where the original quarry is. There is a quarry over at Bachman's, but that was whoever owned that at the time, because it was sort of operated as several different functions in that area. But in 1742 he bought the land, and he founded Millerstown, as it was called. It eventually became Annville in 17, I think it was 17, so it would have been between 1763 and 1764 that the town itself was actually laid out, because they sort of say it might have officially been founded more in 1763, 1764 by the plans that were laid out by Andrew Miller. His son Abraham, from what I've been able to research, actually is the one that got together with Abram Rigel, who had the mill on the eastern side of town. It was on the southern side of the Quittapahilla, and we'll go visit that. And then Adam Ulrich, it was Hans Adam Ulrich, who has been reinterred at the Mount Annville Cemetery. He had his homestead. He was a farmer and had a homestead north of the town. That building still exists. I'm not quite sure where it is exactly. I'm not sure if I'd even be able to get out there to film it. But that is used now as the facilities management building for Lebanon Valley College. So in 1763 and 1764, the three of them laid out their land, and you'll have in the configuration of the town where Lancaster Street is now, it's a much wider street. The reason why that's much wider is because that's where Andrew Miller, or now at that time 1763, 1764, it had been transferred over to Abraham Miller, the son, because Andrew Miller by that time had passed away. The land between Abraham Miller, now Abraham Miller, and Abram Rigel, that's where it met. And so they both sort of divided their lands and made a much larger street. And then Adam Ulrich's was on the north side of Market Street, which is now 422. It was the Dolphin Pike, I believe it was called, and that was a toll road for a period of time. So Queen Street and King Street were like the main streets. Market Street was also a semi-main street as well. And so that was sort of how that developed, and the town developed then from that. Now, there's two different stories about how the name Annville actually came into being. I've heard that Andrew Miller's wife's name was Ann. I've also heard that Abraham Miller's wife was Ann. So there's sort of a little bit confusing. If anybody knows the difference, I mean, especially if Michael Schroeder, you would probably know if you watched this video. And I'll send you a question about it, because you would probably have the best idea, because he's the president of Friends of Old Annville right now. He actually did a really cool article, which I want to make of note. Bachman's Mill. By the plaque, I sort of assumed that when it burnt down, and I believe it was 1911, that was it for the mill. Actually, they did rebuild it. He put some pictures up of the site and did a whole ton of research. It was really cool, so thanks, Michael, for that, because that was neat learning that history. But he had pictures of it from 1960s, And I guess in that time period when it got torn down again, and that was the final hurrah for Bachman's Mill. But so Ann was either the wife of the son or the father, Andrew Miller, who was the original founder. There's also, I think it's Prasanna. I'll have to look at that again, and I'll make a clarification later in the video if it's wrong, because I don't know why I can't retain that name. But Adam Ulrich's wife was named Prasanna. So one train of thought is that they named the town Annville after those two individuals' wives that had some form of Ann. The other thought, which probably in a lot of ways I think is more prevalent, just because Queen Street was the main street here and King Street was also a very prevalent street, it was probably named after Queen Anne, who was very good to the German Huguenots and French Huguenots, which Andrew Miller was a German Huguenot. He was from the Palatinate, and she provided a path over here and also made sure that they had land and that type of stuff. And so he was very appreciative of her. So it makes sense that they might have named it that, like Annville. So there's two trains of thoughts there. Which one's true? Really don't know. And I don't think there's really any way of really knowing, but that's the founding of Annville. It's quite intriguing. It was a really cool town. Like from 1742 when Andrew Miller came here and he sort of found that people were already on his land, a lot of times they would get the sheriff or somebody like that and they'd kick the people off the land. Well, he felt like these people have been here, they've made lives, I won't kick them out, I'll make them start making rent and allow them to build. And so he was beloved in the community. But this was before it became really got laid out in the official founding in 63, 64, 1700s. It was mills, quarries, things of that nature. Very intriguing. And then it eventually evolved into quite a market town as well, and a lot of industry came in here over time, and just a beautiful town. I'll have a lot of pictures up on Instagram and just some of the neat historical structures. So we're going to go over to Jerusalem Church and check that out. Alright, so we're leaving the cemetery here and going along this street. This is just south of Queen Street, but it is cold. I think we'll stop at Jerusalem Church. I'm gonna make some of the other video audio wise, because dang, you know, they say it's supposed to be supposedly, oh, it's like 44 or 45 degrees, but feels like it's a lot colder, and I would be in agreement. So I've talked about it before, not complaining, but my fibromyalgia does not like cold weather, especially when it's windy. So I'm going to spare myself from some of the pain and agony of all that good stuff. So yeah, but we're gonna go this way, and then we're gonna go drive past the mansion and the mill. It would be Abram Reigel's mill. When exactly that was built, it would have had to have been built probably slightly before the 1760s. We know that Andrew Miller's mill, their Brandt's mill, that was built, they think 1740, maybe even a little earlier. Just don't know exactly when. But like I said, the earliest knowledge that, you know, anything that was out there physically to mention Andrew Miller's mill would have been 1742. And Bachman's mill, we know, was probably built around 1740, early 1740s. One thing of note too that we'll talk about with that I find interesting, and I think a lot of people find this interesting as well, which I had somewhat confirmation on it, but this Jerusalem cemetery that we're going to go over to, the interesting thing about that is when that was torn down, like the records are sort of iffy on who's all buried there, but it is thought that the founders were all pretty much buried there. For sure, Hans Adam Ulrich was buried there. He got reinterred along with his wife over to Mount Lebanon Cemetery. Where they are exactly over there, I'm not sure, but probably in the Ulrich plot. I was over there doing some Instagram pics, looking for their gravesides, also looking for the Kreider family, because I plan on doing a video on them. They were quite predominant. He actually bought Abram Reigel's mill. I think some of the other buildings, because you'll see a stone building over there, that was probably part of the mill complex, because the mill is on the other side of the stream here. There's also a stone house that was probably the miller's house, but that is the Abram Reigel mill. And then up here on the hill is the mansion. Now the Reigel family held on to the mansion when they sold it to the Kreider family. His name was David Kreider, and then he had a number of sons who were quite famous. One being a U.S. representative. A number of them were involved with industry. One owned a shoe factory, and we'll go into that family and their history, because they're quite important to the history of Annville. And they're sort of like, you have, like in Lebanon, the Gloninger family was quite important to the history of Lebanon. The Kreider family was very much the same here in Annville. So one thing of note that I was trying to get to, and I just sort of talk, and then don't actually get around to the information. A friend of mine, they were in the Brandt's mill back when I guess it was still operating, and the story goes that the original headstone for either Abraham Miller or for Andrew Miller is on the 3rd floor of the Brandt's mill. And that's not uncommon practice to have, you know, a town, you know, founder like that they keep it in a place where it's going to be kept safe. Now, whether Andrew Miller was buried there and his wife were buried at the Jerusalem cemetery, I just don't know. The records being what they are, the Reigel family was buried there. One of his, I think his son and his grandson, who were also Abram Reigel, were buried there, and I believe are still there. They were never reinterred. So there's probably a good chance that Abram Reigel is still there, and possibly a good chance that the Millers are buried there as well. I just haven't been able to find otherwise, or find confirmation of that. And that's another thing I'll ask Michael Schroeder about, because if anybody's going to know, he probably will, or he can point me in the direction of someone that would potentially know. Because it's just sort of like when these things got torn down, you had no way of knowing, you know, it just, the records weren't what they are. I mean, it's unless you had somebody that was really meticulous and made sure that those things were kept together, things get lost over time, unfortunately. So that's just sort of where we're at with that. Alright, so we are here at Christ United Church of Christ here in Annville. This was the Jerusalem church before it was the old Jerusalem church, which was a combination of the Reformed and Lutheran churches, which originally had worshiped north of Annville. But when they built this, they built the original Jerusalem church. They also had the Jerusalem cemetery, which is where most of the town founders and the early settlers of the Annville region were buried. And that's right here. So we're going to flip this around. So this plot of land, this is where the cemetery was. I'll try to get a picture up if I can find one for you guys, but they do have a memorial that's been erected here. I believe it was by the Boy Scouts as an Eagle Scout project, but the site of Jerusalem Cemetery in memory of all here interred, erected by Christ Church. But yeah, they erected this. It was back in the 50s. They wound out basically running over the cemetery for whatever the reasons were, and that's part of the reasons that they have a lot of these laws now, that you can't just come in and take out a cemetery anymore. But this was at one time was a cemetery. It had a small stone wall, I believe, that was around it, and like I said, most of the town founders and the early settlers and the people that were really important to this, town growing and thriving were buried here. Now, many had been reinterred, but it's sort of, nobody really knows exactly how many were reinterred, how many are still buried here. It just, the records are what they are. I mean, this was one of those things that happened. You think about it, it was 1770s when I think a lot of the first people would have been buried here. So you almost 200 years at that point when they did remove this cemetery, in essence. So it's not shocking that there were issues with that happening. And that was, around the turn, once you got into the 1970s, when they started to really make some changes and started protecting a lot of the things here in Annville, with Friends of Old Annville being created eventually. And then I believe in the 90s, the Quiddy Nature Park, they brought the Annville rail station back. So Friends of Old Annville and the citizens here of Annville have really done a lot to protect their history, the legacy of their predecessors. So yes, this is where they were born. This is a major part of the founding of Annville. This is where the original site of the Jerusalem Cemetery. I want to thank you guys for coming along on this next adventure, second video of the Hometown Foundations, talking about the founding of towns and sort of concentrating on that, the founders, where they came from, and as much information as we can find just to talk about the town. But we will see you, as always, about town. Thanks, everybody.